Welcome, everybody, to Iowa State Cyclones Live here on the Voice of College Football Network. I am your host, Levi Stevenson, and we are here this week to talk about the Iowa State Cyclones and the CYHAWK preview. We are currently live both on my Iowa State channel, Iowa State, the Voice of College Football, as well as the Iowa channel, just so we can get some chimes in here from the Iowa fans as well. And they can get a preview from the other side of the line of scrimmage there from themselves. So, like I said, today we're gonna talk about Iowa State's really impressive win last weekend against South Dakota Coyotes after starting off in Dublin with a win over Kansas State, and get into the CYHAWK week and how this all interacts. So first up, obviously the big deal this weekend. I would say coming back home after a kind of a weird week of travel to Dublin, Ireland. And this is a game too that I think a lot of people had on their calendars. South Dakota is a good football program. They're in top 5 in the FCS preseason poll. This looked like, and then Iowa State's coming off a weird travel situation, going to Ireland. They're getting back late. They have to get acclimated back time wise, and then it's also sandwiched between two rivals, your two biggest rivals, in Kansas State and Iowa. And this was always a game that was circled on the calendar as a place where Iowa State could, I don't know if they were how much, I don't know how scared people were that they were going to totally lay an egg and lose to South Dakota. But, for Iowa State fans in particular, you better believe it was on our minds. And, I think a lot of people at the minimum would be a sympathetic to the idea that they would have a little bit of a letdown and play this game closer than they needed to. But that is not what happened. Iowa State went out on Saturday at 2:30 p.m. against a good South Dakota opponent on Big Fox, and flat out demolished one of the best teams in the FCS. Frankly, a really impressive performance. Just given the situation, given the opponent, being able to just completely put away an opponent, make it a complete non-game game. South Dakota's first possession, they were able to drive down the field and get a touchdown. That was on their the scripted section of their game plan. Obviously usually the first 10 to 15 plays for any team in any game are going to be scripted so that they can move fast. They don't have to worry about communication. They don't have to worry about any of that. They can just go follow their game plan, and that's what they do. South Dakota burned basically all their script plays on that scoring drive. Credit to them. They did a good job. After that, they did virtually nothing. South Dakota quarterback Aiden Bauman, the Iowa State transfer, when you watch him, you can see a quality quarterback. You can absolutely see it. He's got good arm talent. He makes smart decisions. He stands tall in the pocket, doesn't get antsy. You can tell he's played a lot of football. Unfortunately, the defensive game plan was very, very good and helped bottle that up and make it almost a complete non-factor. I do want to give credit, though, to South Dakota's running back as well. I have to go back and find out what his name was, but man, that kid could play. But the Iowa State defense locked them up once again. They made Kansas State's running game non-existent, and South Dakota ran the ball a little bit, not a lot, a little bit, but then they also almost completely nullified Aiden Bauman in the passing game. So, yeah, and honestly, somehow the defense was the weakest of the 3 phases of the game for Iowa State, and it was good. It was really good, but it was somehow the weakest phase of the game because I mean, the only honest way to describe this was it was damn near a perfect football game on the part of Iowa State. Could you have stopped that first drive? Yeah, you could have. Aside from that, you're really, really close to Iowa State playing a perfect football game against South Dakota. We'll start on offense, where Rocco Becht finished 19 of 20 passing. He also had 19-20 passing, 278 yards and 3 touchdowns. No interceptions, obviously. That is That is 13.9 yards per attempt, which is a whole lot. And you start off the first play of the game. You see a deep pass to Brad Eskelson, which we saw a similar deep pass to Jalen Noel last year in the North Dakota game. But you know, I don't know if I was expecting them to just do that again. I think the first year we all thought like, oh, that's a fun way to start. Then they did it again this year. And then just today or yesterday in the media availability for the coaches, Taylor Mauser came out and said, yeah, that first play wasn't, he said the first play wasn't we're just doing it for the fun of it or because it seems cool. They do that because putting Rocco in difficult situations is how he gets in the zone. He's one of those people that when the pressure is low and I would say staff doesn't put any pressure on him, that's when maybe he makes, underthrows something a little bit, makes it, makes a, kind of a little bit off time throw, whatever it is. He's got too much time to think. When Rocco is put in difficult situations and asked to make difficult reads, make difficult throws, that is when he starts ratcheting up his play. And that's when he's at his best. And which frankly makes a lot of sense because, we've been talking about for a long time now about how fourth quarter Rocco is one of the best quarterbacks in college football. When the game is on the line and you need a first down, you need a touchdown, whatever it is, you want Rocco Becht as your quarterback. There's nobody else you should want. You should want Rocco Becht as your quarterback. I just, I love the aggressiveness there from Taylor Mauser, who Iowa State fans have, you know, have come to know Taylor Mauser as kind of this, at times, kind of a mad scientist a little bit, being not being afraid to take some risks. You use some unusual play calls in certain circumstances. And this year we've seen him take a little bit of a step forward and be more and more aggressive. He commented on that in his media availability and talked about how, the thing he learned from last year to this year is that he's better and the offense is better when you choose to be bold and you choose to take a few more risks. And when you try to make things too easy and you try to, win methodically, sometimes that's how things stall out and you struggle on offense. Maybe you turn the ball over more, lots of different things can go wrong. So you have, it's frankly, it's kind of a match made in heaven with the offensive coordinator and the quarterback, because you have a quarterback that does better when you put him in difficult situations, when you ask him to really lead the charge and you give him something to do. Taylor Mauser has determined that he is a better coordinator himself when he has the opportunity or when he decides to be more bold and to take more risks. So Taylor's a better offensive coordinator when he can put his quarterback in more stressful situations and be more aggressive. Rocco is a better quarterback when he is in those situations. It's a match made in heaven in terms of tendencies and what each one does well, what each other wants to do in order to perform their best. They mesh so well. However, against South Dakota decided to completely sell out to stop Iowa State's running game, and which they didn't do a whole lot, until the backups came in and all that. Carson Hansen and Abu Sama both had, relatively nondescript days. They didn't really do a ton. But South Dakota was basically perfectly content to sell out and not let the running game beat them and force Iowa State's passing game and just basically force Iowa State to just pass all the time. And more than happy to do so they were. Of those 20 attempts by Rocco Becht, I believe 15 of them went to tight ends, which is a huge number. And that number illustrates an adjustment on the part of Iowa State that is really, really interesting, because we knew about the tight end depth coming. We knew about Ben Bramer and Gabe Burkle and Cooper Alexander and Tyler Moore and Keaton Roskop. We knew that they had tons of guys in the room that they were going to want to use in the passing game. And we heard rumors of 13 and 14 personnel in the offseason. We're like, 14 personnel is kind of crazy. I don't know what you're going to do with that. Well, we've seen what they're going to do with 13 and 14 personnel, and it's frankly a little unhinged. It is, I mean, this is full mad scientist Taylor Mauser. What they're doing with 14 personnel, they'll start heavy. They'll start in a heavy formation, maybe some sort of like variant on the full house or something like that. In 14 personnel, they'll have, or they're starting a pistol. They'll start in a pistol and with the flanked on two tight ends on each side. Then they will immediately motion out to empty. They'll motion out to empty, take the running back out of the backfield entirely, motion to empty. And then you see what the defense is doing. If the defense has adjusted to push out to cover all these tight ends out on the perimeter, you can run if you keep the running back in and you don't go to empty and you keep one running back in, you go to 4 wide. That opens up a lot of running lanes for them. Or if you motion the running back out, you've got QB power right there. And Rocco is a very good QB power runner. If the defense chooses to remain largely in their base shell, which Iowa does a lot, they typically don't get too crazy with moving guys around. They like to stay where they're at. They like to stay in their base defense and just work out of that. If they continue to do that, you're going to end up with matchups on the perimeter where it's 6'7" Ben Bramer against a 5'11" or a 6-foot cornerback. And that is a matchup that Iowa State fans and that Iowa State would love to see as often as possible, because there are very few corners in college football, very few 6-foot corners in college football that are going to be equipped to deal with Ben Bramer on a regular basis, and especially in the red zone. Unfortunately, Iowa State decided to go after some poor bastard on the South Dakota defense, and they hit him twice in the red zone with Ben Bramer just catching a ball over the top of him. Like, I mean, like you're playing backyard football with a bunch of 6th graders. It's an unfair matchup for the defense to have to deal with. And frankly, that has dealing with Iowa State's heavy tight end sets and how they're motioning guys out is probably a big, I would be shocked if that's not a big, point of emphasis for Phil Parker this week, because that is not something that Iowa ever has to defend. They don't ever have to defend 4 tight ends on the field, with 2 of them being at least 2 of them being very good receivers. Tyler Moore had a nice catch last week too. They will throw the ball to any of those 4 receivers. It's a unique defensive challenge for Iowa, especially given that the Hawks right now have major questions in their secondary. The corners, I don't know anybody that feels great about Iowa's corners. The safeties, maybe, but Xavier Wampa, as proved in last year's CYHAWK game, is a liability in deep coverage. So you're dealing with all this. You're dealing with all these tight ends on the perimeter. All of a sudden, now they motion back into a heavy set. You've brought in personnel. You've adjusted your scheme to deal with this wide set and dealing with your tight ends on the perimeter. I would say it goes back into a heavy set. And all of a sudden now you're too small, you're too slow, and your defense isn't prepared to deal with now 4 tight ends blocking for Abu Sama or Carson Hansen, who are going to be, especially Carson Hansen, who's probably coming screaming through an A gap, ready to lay his shoulders directly into a linebacker's chest. Yeah, Jay Bird brings a great point up here. On that red zone thing, Bramer didn't have to jump. He was literally just backpedaling and caught it above his head, and the corner looked completely helpless. He had no shot. There was no shot at defending that. And Ben Bramer didn't jump. Iowa will have the same issues. I would be shocked if Iowa State is on the 5-yard line or the 10-yard line next week. I would be shocked if we didn't see something like this to get Ben Bramer on a corner on the outside and watch them go to Bramer in the end zone with that matchup. I'd be shocked if they didn't. And the only reason they wouldn't is if Iowa brings safeties over to bracket Burkle and Bramer on the perimeter and chooses to leave the middle of the field open, in which case you can have Tyler Moore there. Maybe you got a receiver Maybe you've got Xavier Townsend parked inside on the slot with Ben Bramer on the outside, which is, again, unhinged. But then if you get that, your safeties are out of the middle of the field. Give me Xavier Townsend to beat his man one-on-one on a slant route or on an in-breaking route or even on a zig route. Give me Xavier Townsend to win that matchup. This offense, as it's been running right now, creates massive problems for a defense that is schematically fairly inflexible. They've got good players. Iowa's got a good defense. I'm not saying they don't have a good defense. They have a good defense. Their front seven's very good. But schematically, they like to sit in their base shell. They don't like to move around. They don't like to flex around. They don't like to, when guys are motioning around, they may expand and contract a little bit, but for the most part, they're going to sit where they're at. Accelerator says, my honest prediction, Iowa Hawkeyes 135, Clone 6. You know what? If you're correct, good on you. It's just what Iowa State is doing with its tight ends right now is really, really unique. And it's a very interesting problem that Phil Parker will have to figure out how to deal with. Because the other part of this equation here, Aaron says Iowa has. Oh wait, whoop! I actually missed it. So Iowa has no offense, dude. They haven't shown me anything more than last year. I'm praying to gods we beat ISU. We'll talk about them in a little defense when we talk about the other side of the football, but it's an interesting point. Sama's also a decent threat as a receiver. Would love to see him either leak out or hit a Texas route or a wheel route. That's the thing too, is we haven't seen in the first two games. We really haven't seen the running backs used in the passing game much at all. And that is a weapon that Iowa State has in its pocket. We know that they are more than comfortable throwing the ball to Carson Hansen and Abu Sama. We know that they're fine with that. We have not seen it at all this year. We have not seen what that looks like in the context of all these new personnel packages that Iowa State is rolling out. We haven't seen that. And I would guess we might see something like that. We might see, a fun little, go to 23 personnel and have a misdirect where basically Sama and Carson both go to the flats and the screen is just to whichever side you call the offensive line to, basically. And I was forced to literally flip a coin to figure out which side they're going to defend, or they're going to divide their defense, obviously. So something like that is just asking to be run against an Iowa team that has not seen that and is not, their base shell isn't necessarily equipped to deal with tons and tons of pre-snap formation, pre-snap movement and stuff like that. It's not that they can't handle it, but it's not, it doesn't react the same way that like Iowa State's 3-3 stack does or anything like that, where guys will move around and adjust to all this stuff. Yeah, the 4th and 1 against Kansas State at the end of the game is the only notable time I've seen them target a running back in the passing game. But that's absolutely in their pocket. The other part of this, about this passing game that makes this difficult, is we just saw the first few notable touches, the first few touches for Xavier Townsend this past week, the transfer receiver from UCF. Now, this is a guy that if you've been watching the show, this is a guy that I have been beating the Xavier Townsend drum since he committed last November or December or whatever it was. Ever since we knew he was going to be here, I've been beating that drum. That Xavier Townsend is going to be a game changer here. Now, it appears that he's not going to be returning kicks and punts because Aiden Flora has rightfully stolen that job, which we will talk about that here in a little bit because he's off to an amazing start on special teams. But we saw the first little bits of Xavier Townsend this past week, and the first touch he got was out in the flat, and we saw some really impressive elusiveness and some wiggle there where he turned a catch that was about 2 or 3 yards downfield and turned it into like 10 or 12. It was a really nice little play, and then obviously we saw him score later on the jet sweep end around. And that's the kind of thing. His role will continue to expand as he gets more and more comfortable. It appeared like I would imagine that his usage in plays will be up this week, whether it's as a target or as a decoy, like on a jet sweep or something like that. He's going to be more active in Iowa State's scheme, I think, this week, because I I think I can get him in matchups, especially in the slot, the same way you got Jalen Knoll free on that backside on the backside post where he took to the house, um, where he beat Xavier Nwamp on the double move last year. If I'm Iowa State, I am loving the idea of using my tight ends to really distract the hell out of the defense. And all of a sudden, Xavier Townsend is wide open on a backside post. I guess that was a frontside post. But, you know, I I think we're going to see an expansion of Xavier Townsend's role this week, and I'm really excited to see that. And that adds another dimension to this thing that makes continues to make this offense a really difficult one to scheme against because you just don't know what they're doing. There's a lot of unpredictability built into this play calling scheme, and that's absolutely intentional on the part of Taylor Mauser. The offensive line for Iowa State is going to be a big factor in this one. Iowa's got a very good front seven, very, very good defensive line, much like Kansas State did. You want to see continued growth. They did look, they were doing what they could in the running game, given that South Dakota was selling out to stop the run. But they looked good in pass pro. South Dakota never really threatened Rocco in any meaningful way. They looked good there. You want to keep seeing more and more growth out of that offensive line, especially against Iowa. But, we saw them do it against Kansas State, who's, again, a very good front seven in their own right. And I don't see any reason they can't do it against Iowa. It's just going to be, one of their biggest tests of the year, the offensive line. This is one of, the two best defensive lines they were going to run up against were probably Iowa and Kansas State. They had a good game against Kansas State, especially in the second half, had a good game against Kansas State. They can do it against Iowa. We need to see that. And we'll see how that manifests in Iowa, leaning on its run game like it did against Kansas State, which I know they would probably like to do. But we've also seen that if Iowa is going to really sell out to stop the run, Iowa State is more than happy to go start throwing the ball around and hit its tight ends all over the place. Yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at on offense. So, Dylan Jaybird says Dylan Lee was impressive and Flora has been impressive on special teams, whether he's a gunner or a returner. I really hope Flora is able to play this weekend. Yeah, we're going to talk about special teams here in a little bit and exactly how Aiden Flora figures into all of this. But Dylan Lee did come in towards the end of really basically the entire last quarter and a half of the South Dakota game. He was the primary running back, and he looked good. He's got wiggle. He's got speed, good vision. I don't know for sure if that was enough to get him, carries against Iowa in any critical situations. I don't know. Maybe it was. That would depend on, I have no reason to believe that Carson Hansen, Abu Sama aren't healthy, but if for whatever reason one of them is a little bit banged up, maybe then you would definitely see Dylan Lee get some, or if, Hansen and Sama are both having bad games or whatever. But either way, Dylan Lee looked good. You have to be encouraged by what you saw from Dylan Lee whenever his name is going to get called for meaningful stuff. Let's flip over to the other side of the ball now. You have to excuse me. My voice is really hoarse. I've been kind of half sick since I got home from Ireland. Move over to the other side of the ball. Iowa State on defense, Iowa on offense. The great news for Iowa State on defense is we've seen an okay analog for Iowa in the form of Kansas State. Both have quarterbacks that can run the ball. Avery Johnson's a different kind of runner than Mark Gronowski. Mark Gronowski is definitely more of a physical runner that's okay with finding contact. Avery Johnson is a coward that is very fast. Iowa State has generally been able to deal with both in the past, but especially if you know that it's coming. The tricky part for Iowa State will obviously be dealing with Iowa's offensive line and that running game, who they ran for 300 yards against Albany. We will see if they can follow that up against a defense with a pulse. Albany is not only an FCS school, but they are a bad FCS school. Iowa did what Iowa should do against FCS teams, which is dominate the offensive line, dominate the line of scrimmage with their offensive line and let the running backs do their thing. Um, Freshman Xavier Williams had a good day. Tough guy to bring down. Very much reminiscent of like a Sean Green type, if any Iowa State fans are remember that guy. Doak Walker Award winner, I believe, or finalist at least for Iowa. Tough guy to bring down. Not necessarily the fastest guy, but good enough in Iowa's scheme to do what he needs to do, basically. They've got a few other guys. Jazz Patterson's in there, worth noting. Kamari Moulton, we'll see if he's playing this week. I don't know. He got injured last week. I don't know if Moulton is playing or not. That's really what you're dealing with for Iowa State's defense. The tricky part here, weirdly, the X factor, I can't believe I'm saying this. The X factor for Iowa on offense is their passing game, which frankly is a crazy sentence. But I really think it's true, because Mark Gronowski was not only, his final stat line, I think it was 8 for 15 for 44 yards, something in that neighborhood. Not good. Just a real tough day. I'll pull it up just to make sure I get the exact right. I know they had 44 yards passing. 8 of 15, 44 yards passing and a touchdown for 2.9 yards per attempt, 5.5 yards per completion. Now, he did finish better than he started. I think he completed like 6 of his last 7 or something like that. His first quarter and a half were some of the worst football I've ever seen from an Iowa quarterback. It was befuddling. It didn't make any sense. But he was taking easy throws, like a 20-yard completion to a wide open receiver in the end zone, and short hopping it by 5-10 yards. It was pretty wild to see. He was missing rudimentary throws by 10 feet. It was befuddling. I don't understand. Like, nobody could figure anything out about why this was happening. He got better, but the way he started that game and just the complete lack of initiative from Iowa, from Tim Lester in the passing game, the willingness to just not even attempt to get your quarterback in any sort of rhythm throwing the ball, was a confusing decision for me, to say the least. And if I were an Iowa fan, I would feel very unsatisfied with the complete lack of attempt to establish any sort of an acceptable passing game. Now, Iowa as an offense, as a program, is never going to ever be the program that sits back and is getting ready to throw for 3 bills or for 350, 400 yards. It's never going to happen. Usually if they break 200 yards passing, that was a big day. They had 44 against one of the worst teams in the FBS or in the FCS. And they really didn't try. Granted, that was because they ran for 300 yards in Albany. And I totally get wanting to just run the ball and get out of that game. I get it. I do. The problem is that transfer players take a while to get up to speed. Especially transfer quarterbacks need time. They need reps in the offense to figure out what's going on, to get up to speed to the FBS game, to get more feel for where their scheme is at. Only throwing 15 passes, and especially those first like 7 or 8 of them, and deciding we're going to do as little passing as possible this game instead of getting Gronowski into any sort of reasonably, good rhythm. I frankly think is a mistake. Because now you're asking Mark Gronowski to finally find his sea legs in the FBS at a Power 4 program. You're asking him to do that on the road against one of the better defenses on his schedule, one of the better teams on his schedule, and one of the best secondaries he's going to face all year. Maybe the best secondary he's going to face all year. And that just seems like a dubious proposition to expect him to go from, what that just abomination we saw against Albany and then magically turn into Andrew Luck against Iowa State on the road. That seems risky to me. especially because Iowa's running game is going to be running into a defense that is very deep at the linebacker, at the safety spot, at the corner spot. You know, they're deep with bodies at all of the, especially at linebacker and safety. Iowa State has plenty of dudes, plenty of capable people in that depth chart to be able to sit there and deal with an Iowa run, a persistent Iowa running game that is just going over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. They've got the bodies to stay fresh. I think the game plan, a game plan that revolves around trying to wear down the Iowa State defense via the running game for Iowa is not a winning one. There's too much depth for Iowa State at the two most important positions in terms of stopping the run in Iowa State's defense, the linebackers and the safeties. Because they're all sitting behind Dominic Orange on the defensive line, one of the best nose tackles in college football. How Iowa chooses to deal with him with their offensive line, how they choose to handle Dominic Orange, I think is going to be a major tipping point one way or the other into how this thing goes. Because if Iowa is having to dedicate 2 or even 3 guys to dealing with Dominic Orange in the running game, especially, that leaves open spaces for Kenny Eziogu, for Tamatoa McDonough, Vontroy Malone on the defensive line to start shooting gaps and try to blow stuff up in the backfield. Or that's Bo Goodwin or Caleb Bacon, Cooper Ebo, Will McLaughlin, Caleb Brazina, any of those guys at the linebacker. Or coming down from safety, you've got Jamison Patton, Marcus Neal, Kyjon Cummings-Coleman, Drew Surges, who's had a very good start to his season, and Carson Van Dinter. You've got all of these guys coming now. This is the defense that is probably the best equipped to slug it out with Iowa in a running game. But if Iowa State can get out to lead and force Iowa to play from behind, if Iowa State can get out to lead, force Iowa to play from behind, Iowa's passing game has so many question marks around it right now. With one, can Mark Gronowski hit the broadside of a barn? And 2, what Iowa pass catcher can be an actual game changer? We know that they can catch a 5-yard hitch route. Can any of them catch something in the middle of the field? Can they catch it on a slant and turn a 5-yard gain into 15? Can they take one 30 or 40 yards to the house? I don't know. We haven't seen any of that. The longest completion last week was Jacob Gill for 13 yards. And I think he ran a little bit after. I think he might have run a little bit after the catch. I don't remember now for sure. But there's so many questions around the Iowa passing game that I think if you can get Iowa playing from behind where they have to pass, Iowa State is more than happy to play that game. They've got plenty of secondary talent and experience to deal with whatever a passing game Iowa's going to come up with. And that's, you're probably seeing a theme here. And I will summarize my theme here towards the end of the show here, and just kind of once I start getting into kind of a prediction. But I just think the game plan for Iowa State on defense is much more simple than what Iowa has to do on defense to stop Iowa State's offense. For Iowa State on defense, it's bottle up the run, make them throw it. Period. That's it. That's all there is to it. That's how you win. And for Iowa State on offense, don't give them the ball. Don't turn the ball over. Let's go to special teams. Special teams is a fascinating thing in this game, because ordinarily this is a phase of the game that Iowa blows teams out in terms of field position, the hidden yardage, stuff like that. And I have no reason to believe Iowa is not yet again one of the better special teams in the country. However, up to this point, Iowa State has also been very good on special teams, specifically in the kicking and return games. We'll start with the kicker in Kyle Conrarty, who, outside of a long field goal against Kansas State at the beginning of the game in the rain, which was never going to go in. That's not his fault. That that attempt should have never happened. He is otherwise perfect, and on Saturday hit the school record 63-yard field goal. I know last week Drew Stevens for Iowa also hit his career long of 55. So both kickers have a good leg. Kyle Camardes is bigger. But field goal kicking's elite. Both teams have elite returners. Aiden Flora, assuming he's healthy, had a huge week last week. Averaged 57.5 yards per punt return. He brought the first one back for a touchdown, but it was ruled it was brought back about 20 yards for stepping 1 inch out of bounds, basically. And he's been effective on kick returns. Had a really nice kick return later in the game against Kansas State. Yeah, they've got their guy back there. He's really effective. I expect, as long as he's healthy, I expect that to be a productive spot for Iowa State. Iowa has Braden Weegan, Caden Weegan. Good returner. Had a big kick return at the very, very end of last year's CYHAWK game. He's a good returner. Iowa State absolutely needs to, in the punting game especially, Iowa State really needs to make sure that your gunners are downfield accounting for him. I think if it makes sense, just kick it out of bounds. There's no real reason to give him the ball, especially given the lack of explosion on Iowa's offense. Giving them an extra 10 yards on offense versus putting the hands in of Caden Weegan, I think is a no-brainer. If you're either letting Weegan field the ball at the 15 or the 20-yard line, or you can kick it out of bounds at the 30 and make the offense take over at the 30. I think you take that option, 9 times out of 10. There's not a lot of upside to actually letting, Weegan field any punts, basically, or at least field any of them clean. So, Tyler Perkins, this is up to you. Obviously it's punter Tyler Perkins. This is him. This is his responsibility to know how dangerous that returner is, the situations that it's okay to kick it to him, like especially if you're maybe in short yardage, if you're like on the 50-yard line or something like that, and you don't really have any. There's no chance for you to outkick your coverage. In that situation, you're putting it out of bounds, or you're not worrying about it. In that situation, kicking out of the back of the end zone isn't the worst thing ever. Making Iowa's offense drive 80 yards is a perfectly acceptable outcome at the end of a punt. If you have to choose between that and letting Weegan field a punt, just take the touchback. It's fine. There's no downside to that. So, special teams is a big one. If either team is able to get a big return, flip the field, God forbid, return one for a touchdown. If either team is able to do that, that could be a massive, massive tipping point for this game. Because the special teams or a turnover score in this game is typically damn near, it's one of the last nails in the coffin typically for the other team, just because the scoring tends to be very, very tight. So we'll see how that shakes out. Turnovers and penalties. The penalty thing is neither team is a particularly penalty heavy team. Iowa State's only committed 3 through the first 2 weeks. I don't think Iowa committed very many, or if at all, or like one or two against Albany. They're typically not a heavily penalized team. I would not expect a lot of penalties in this game. Maybe a couple, but not very many. Turnovers. Iowa's defense basically lives on turnovers. The defense is set up to give you a little bit here and there, just give you a little bit, and then just wait. They're waiting. They're begging of you to get impatient, to force a ball someplace, to get overly aggressive, to get too cute, and then they strike, and they intercept a pass, they force a fumble, they stop you behind the line for a 4-yard loss, whatever. That's when Iowa's defense strikes. They pounce as soon as you make a little mistake. So you need, if Iowa State can get 19 of 20, Rocco, on Saturday, it's going to be a long day. It's going to be a real long day for Iowa. But that is going to be the key there. If Iowa State can take care of the ball and not give Iowa any short fields or any extra possessions, or if you turn it over, on the 10-yard line. A red zone turnover against Iowa isn't necessarily catastrophic. It's not really much different than punting it, basically. You'd like to get the points, obviously, but there are more fearful, more prolific offenses that you would regret a lot more leaving in that spot. The turnover battle will go a long ways here. If Iowa does turn it over, that's major problems for them because, like I said, I don't think that team is remotely equipped to play from behind. If they have to come back from 2 scores down, you do not love Iowa State. You do not love Iowa's chances. They just don't have the firepower to go on quick drives or anything like that. They just don't. So it's tricky. So I want to talk to this is kind of my overall feelings on the game. Not necessarily like matchup specific. There's when you're looking at this game from the outside. For one, the weather on Saturday is supposed to be 65 and sunny. Perfect weather. Beautiful weather for this game. So fortunately, like rain and wind should not be such a big deal. When you're looking at just kind of where these two teams are at right now, I think the external factors for this game lean extremely heavily in Iowa State's favor. You have a team that's played 2 games against 2 good opponents. One of them is not all that dissimilar from Iowa. Schematically, maybe they're a little bit different, but as far as just what the teams are trying to do and how they play football, not all that different from Iowa. Kansas State likes to do things fairly similarly to how Iowa does them. They're more dynamic. They've got more athleticism at the skill positions. Their quarterback's a different style of runner. But how they want to win games is basically the same. And you've proven that you can beat a team like that. You've also proven against a good South Dakota team that you're perfectly happy winning a game through the air and letting Rocco be Rocco and letting your tight ends dominate a game and create tons and tons of matchup problems all over the place and letting your receivers be a kind of a fun little X factor that we really haven't seen much yet. Iowa has no tape on Chase Soul. They have little tape on Xavier Townsend. They have tape on Brett Eskelson catching some deep balls. They know that he's a player to pay attention to. But that's it. They've got one guy. Mitchell Hager wants to know, is Kansas State better than Iowa? What a fascinating question at this point in the season. It's an interesting question because Kansas State, even if they have some problems, is very clearly the superior team on offense. It's really not close. They've got a better run. They've got a much better passing game, even though I'm not an Avery Johnson guy. Their offense is far more dynamic than Iowa's is. Is their defense as good as Iowa's? Probably not, but it's not a big step down. If you were asking me to go like win a game, I would prefer to have Kansas State because the ceiling is just so much higher with Kansas State, I think, than Iowa. I don't know, but Iowa's defense, that's a tough question. And Kansas State also didn't look great against North Dakota, but they had a tough travel situation from Ireland, not reading too much into that game. I think right now I would give a slight lean to Kansas State, mainly only on the basis of raw talent and skill, raw talent and athleticism. But it's not much different, really. I mean, they're basically right on par with each other. If we ever saw more from Iowa's offense, I would be more inclined to lean towards Iowa. But man, that right now the offense is hoping on a prayer that that running game can get them 250 yards on the ground against Iowa State to have a shot. But the real thing here I'm looking at, though, you have two teams. Both teams have a checklist. When you're looking at how this game's going to go, both teams have a checklist. Iowa State's checklist, they have a checklist of the different ways they can try to win this game. They can win by throwing the ball to their tight ends, to their receivers. They can win through the passing game with their quarterback, Rocco. They can win with the running game, with their two-headed monster and Carson Hansen, Rob Usama, and their tight ends that they can provide, they can provide 8 blockers, 9 blockers on every single running play. You can win via special teams not just special teams, but you can win, with a heavy special teams win by flipping the field, getting long returns, being accurate on your field goals and punting well. They can win games that way. They can win games through the turnover battle. They can do lots of different things. They can win games lots of different ways. Iowa's checklist is a multi-step checklist on things that have to go right for them to win this game. They have to be able to run the ball, period. Have to be able to run the ball. If they're not getting 200 yards out of their running game, it's not happening. Iowa has to be able to run the ball. They also have to win the turnover battle. They cannot give Iowa State more possessions than they have, period. They have to win the turnover battle. They have to win the field position battle. Have to do that. Their offense is not capable of consistently driving the field the way Iowa State's is. Just not. You need to win. You need those 3 things to go right, I think. The turnover battle in a running game get you close. And depending on how those look, that could be enough. But Iowa is looking at a checklist that requires multiple things to be checked off for them to create their path to victory. Iowa State's path to victory is multifaceted. They can win this game multiple ways. Iowa's got like 2. And that's if they just completely blow Iowa State in the running game away. Just completely blow them away. Or Iowa State Iowa State just gives them the ball 3 or 4 times. That's there. You're looking at one team where you have to squint real hard. You have to really look to try to find a weakness that can be exploited in terms of Iowa State. There's no major weaknesses on this entire team. There are no spots on that entire roster, on that entire 2 deep that you're looking at is like, this is where we can attack. This guy's weak. We can go after this guy. There isn't a single player on that entire 2 deep that you can do that. Not one. There isn't one part of the offense you're like, I don't think they can do this. We know they can run the ball against a good front 7. They did it against Kansas State. I don't know if they can throw the ball. They just completed 15 passes at tight ends for fun. Like, they've got pass catchers. They've got one of the best quarterbacks in college football. There's a reason that Rocco is getting early Heisman hype from ESPN. It's because he's been incredible on the international and national stage. Iowa State will be playing its 3rd nationally televised game in a row. Or at least on a major network, I should say. They're pretty much all nationally televised anymore because of streaming apps. But as far as on a major network goes, big noon kickoffs there. If we see a big game from Rocco, have another really good game, and Iowa State wins this game, the Heisman talk for Rocco heats up. And transforms from an early, like, oh, he's had a couple really nice games and Iowa State's kind of a fun team right now, to Iowa State's 3-0. They're knocking on the door of the top 10. Rocco's been one of the best players in college football so far. That kind of Heisman talk. And I think there's too many stars that need to align for Iowa to feel any bit of confidence in picking them to win this game. Now, for anybody that's seen any of my podcasts before, there's no shot in hell I would ever pick anybody besides Iowa State to win this game. I would 100 times out of 100 be wrong about Iowa State winning than be right about Iowa winning. That would suck. But if you're an objective observer, if you're an Iowa fan, you got to do some mental gymnastics to figure out where the advantage lies in this game for Iowa. You're really hoping the hopes and dreams of this game for you lie in Rocco giving you the ball a couple times and Dominic Orange having a really bad game. If both of those don't happen, it's going to be an uphill battle. Iowa just doesn't have the firepower to deal with Iowa State on a long, drawn-out game, especially if Iowa State's getting multiple possessions and gets an extra one from a turnover or something like that, or gets a short field from a good special teams play, whatever it is. There's too many things that have to go right for Iowa in this, I think. And Iowa State the roster is so deep and experienced, and this team feels so stable and so dependable that it feels like they're just not really susceptible to having enough things go wrong to let Iowa win this without, Iowa also doing their own homework on the way through. So for that reason, I don't think it makes any sense besides a homer pick for Iowa. I just don't see how it makes any sense to pick anybody other than Iowa State to win this game. Everything is pointing in the direction of Iowa State for this game. The quarterback position. At best, the running back position is a push. I think you could argue that I think it's a push. Iowa State's got the better top two. Iowa's maybe got the deeper room. The offensive line will give Iowa the advantage there. Defensive line, maybe slightly in Iowa, but Dominic Orange's an individual talent is incredible. Iowa State's linebackers and Iowa's linebackers push, maybe slight advantage for Iowa State just due to the depth. Secondary, heavy lean in favor of Iowa State. Pass catchers and skill positions, gargantuan lean in favor of Iowa State. Massive lean. The gap between Iowa State's pass catchers and Iowa's pass catchers is bigger than any position group gap we've seen in this game in at least a decade. At least. And if you're asking me which coach, and I would frankly argue that in terms of coaching staff and coaching ability, especially in close game situations, if you're asking me to compare offensive coordinators, I think Taylor Mauser is pretty clearly head and shoulders above Tim Lester in terms of play calling and in terms of designing a scheme, in terms of being aggressive when you need to, making the right calls when you need to. I think Taylor Mauser is very clearly is a big advantage for Iowa State in terms of play calling and scheme. Defensive coordinator, you give Iowa a slight edge, but John Haycock and Phil Parker are two of the best 4 or 5 defensive coordinators in college football, and neither of them are 5. I would say they're both top 4 at worst. They're both incredibly good at their jobs. But I will, if they're the best and second best coordinators in college football, I will give the slight lean to Phil Parker. But it's mostly a push in terms of defensive coordinators. And the special teams are both playing well. Which is all to say, really, when you take the sum total of the gap between position groups across the team, across the two deeps, there's so many things pointing in the direction of Iowa State here. I mean, even as a homer, like I said, I would never pick Iowa to win this game. But at this point, I looked at the 2.5-point spread from Vegas, and I couldn't figure out how they were justifying it. That's essentially saying that Iowa would be a favor on a neutral field, which feels insane to me. I understand it's a rivalry game and that weird shit happens. I get it. I do. And maybe weird shit will happen. Maybe Mark Gronowski turns into Andrew Luck on Saturday and we're all dumbfounded. but I don't see it. I just don't. There's too much evidence for Iowa State that Iowa State is a good, solid, consistent football team, and a versatile football team. There's too much evidence pointing in that direction for me to give credence even to that 2.5 point favorite. So my score prediction for Saturday. I've been thinking about this a little bit because I mean the going wisdom, I guess, is that this game is going to be low scoring and all this. And I think it will be lower scoring. But we also had that random aberration in 2011 that should have been low scoring and ended up being 44-41. However, I do not think this will be that game. So I'm going to predict a 24-10 victory for the Cyclones in Ames. I know a two-score victory in this game is blasphemy, and I'm sure some of the Iowa fans in here are not happy with me for that prediction. I just don't see how Iowa scores points in this game outside of a short field or a turnover. I don't see it. I don't see the path to victory for Iowa. And I see Iowa State having far too many weapons and options all over the place in this game for Iowa to consistently keep up on offense. It's just not going to happen. So I think this is like a 17-10 game going late, and Iowa gives the ball back with 9 minutes. Iowa scored, maybe it's like a 17-10 game. It's a 17-10 game in the fourth quarter. Iowa, like Mark Gronowski throws a pick or he fumbles it or something. Iowa State gets the ball back with like 9 minutes left, and they kind of grind down the field a little bit, eventually get a touchdown to pull away to 24-10. Iowa's only got a couple minutes left to drive. They stall out. Iowa State kneels it out. So that's my prediction for Saturday. 24-10 Iowa State. Just too many things going in the direction of Iowa State for this game for me to pick it any closer than this and feel good about myself. So I could be wrong. And if Iowa State wins this game by 1, sweet. I'm more than happy to be wrong. In the case of Iowa State winning this game by 1 score. But I think there's just a big gap right now. Iowa played one half of good football against a bad FCS team. Iowa State has played 6.5 good quarters of football against 2 very good teams. So that'll have it. Appreciate everybody for tuning in to this week's episode of Iowa State Cyclones Live here on the Voice of College Football. If you're an Iowa fan and you hung around and you were in the comments, I really appreciate you for tuning in. I'm always happy to have everybody tune in, even if you disagree with me, especially if you disagree with me. I'm more than happy to have you tune in and disagree with me in the comments and in the chat and all that. I love to debate people on this type of stuff and just, see what's all going on in the minds of the fans. And if you're an Iowa State fan and you're new here, I really appreciate you joining in. Please, if you would be so kind as to like and subscribe the Iowa State, the Voice of College Football YouTube channel, so we can continue to grow this and help the algorithm find this thing a little bit better. And if you're returning, thanks for coming back. I appreciate it. So that'll wrap her up for this week. I appreciate everybody for tuning in, and we will. If anybody's going to Jack Trice on Saturday, maybe I'll see you there. We'll be there bright and early, having a good time, and see how this game goes. So everybody, have a great rest of your week. Go Cyclones.